In the rolling hills of Kentucky, where forgotten meadows still cling to the morning mist, stand the crumbling remains of what was once Pleasant Hill. This Shaker community vanished overnight in 1834, over 300 souls disappearing without a trace. They left behind only empty buildings and a silence so profound that even now, locals refuse to walk those grounds after dark. For nearly 2 centuries, the official record has been kept sealed by the state of Kentucky, buried in archives few are brave enough to examine. But a truth so horrifying it challenges everything we thought we knew about America's religious communities has been revealed by recently uncovered testimonies from a visiting Ohio inspector. What happened at Pleasant Hill wasn't just a tragedy. It was 27 years of systematic terror, holy devotion disguising something far darker. Before we uncover the dark truth that authorities tried so desperately to hide, I need to ask something of you. This channel isn't for everyone. It is only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you are one of the select few who seeks these hidden truths, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Now, let's step back in time to discover how a family's greed transformed a sacred community into something far more sinister. What would become one of Kentucky's most carefully concealed secrets began in 1807 as a beacon of spiritual purity, orchestrated by a family whose corruption ran deeper than anyone could imagine. The year was 1807, and like wildfire, the Second Great Awakening was sweeping across Kentucky. In this atmosphere of religious fervor, Pleasant Hill emerged as a sanctuary. Those seeking to live according to Shaker principles, celibacy, communal property, and separation from the world's corruption, found a home here. The community, nestled in the fertile bluegrass region near Harrodsburg, attracted hundreds of converts who willingly surrendered their earthly possessions for the promise of spiritual perfection. At the heart of this seemingly devout community stood the Richardson family, their influence permeating every aspect of daily life. Elder Samuel Richardson, a tall man with piercing gray eyes and a voice that could command any congregation, had arrived from Ohio. He claimed direct ordination from Mother and Lee's original disciples. His carefully maintained appearance, always dressed in simple but immaculate Shaker garb, and his encyclopedic knowledge of Shaker theology convinced even skeptical visitors of his authenticity. His wife, Sister Martha Richardson, had publicly renounced their marriage to maintain Shaker celibacy while secretly continuing their relationship in the privacy of Samuel's expanded quarters. An almost supernatural ability to read people's motivations and fears was possessed by Martha, a skill she used to devastating effect in managing the community's complex social dynamics. Her soft-spoken manner and gentle smile masked a calculating intelligence that rivals found both intimidating and irresistible. Throughout the community, their family network extended like the roots of an ancient oak. Their eldest son, Brother Ezekiel Richardson, a broad-shouldered man with his father's commanding presence, managed the community's extensive agricultural operations. He had transformed Pleasant Hill's farming from subsistence agriculture into a commercial enterprise that supplied produce markets throughout the Ohio River Valley. His younger brother, Brother Caleb Richardson, served as the community's unofficial security chief, monitoring members' private conversations and correspondence with an efficiency that would have impressed any modern intelligence operation. The women's dormitories and new convert orientation were overseen by Sister Rebecca Richardson, Samuel and Martha's eldest daughter. At 28, she had never married, channeling what observers described as fierce maternal instincts into managing the female members. Her ability to break down psychological defenses and rebuild personalities according to Richardson family specifications was legendary among those who survived her spiritual counseling sessions. The community's official records and correspondence were maintained by the youngest Richardson daughter, Sister Patience. Despite being only 24, she possessed a gift for forgery that allowed her to craft convincing letters in any handwriting style. Her meticulous record-keeping created the documentary facade that protected the family's operations from outside scrutiny after studying a person's writing for just a few days. The community's profitable furniture workshops were controlled by Samuel's brother, Brother Jeremiah Richardson. A master craftsman who had learned woodworking before the family's corruption began, Jeremiah maintained the quality standards that made Pleasant Hill furniture sought after throughout Kentucky and beyond. His workshops employed nearly 50 community members in what appeared to be dignified craftsmanship, but functioned more like a forced labor operation. Their lucrative seed business that supplied farms across 3 states was managed by brother Isaiah Richardson, Samuel's cousin. Isaiah's monthly travels to distant customers provided perfect cover for activities that would have horrified his business partners. His gentle demeanor and obvious expertise in agricultural matters made him welcome at farms from Ohio to Tennessee, where his true purposes remained carefully hidden. The community's kitchens and food distribution were supervised by Martha's sister, Sister Hannah Collins. Her control over nutrition allowed the family to reward compliance and punish dissent in ways that appeared natural to outside observers. Hannah had studied the effects of various herbs and substances, knowledge she applied with scientific precision to manage the community's psychological and physical health. Crucial roles were played even by the extended family. A living symbol of the community's supposed spiritual authenticity was served by Samuel's elderly mother, Mother Sarah Richardson. Her presence lent credibility to Samuel's claims of long-standing Shaker connections, while her apparent frailty made her an unlikely suspect in any wrongdoing. In reality, Mother Sarah was the family's strategic mastermind, her decades of experience in manipulation guiding their long-term planning. The community's external relationships with local authorities and neighboring communities were managed by Brother Nathan Richardson, Samuel's youngest brother. His charm and apparent sincerity had convinced Sheriff William Morrison of Mercer County that Pleasant Hill was a model religious community deserving protection and support. Nathan's regular donations to local churches and civic organizations purchased goodwill that proved invaluable when questions arose about the community's activities. Throughout Kentucky and beyond, the community's reputation spread. Visitors marveled at the pristine buildings, constructed with materials purchased through the community's legitimate business profits. The perfectly ordered gardens, maintained by members who worked from dawn to dusk, produced vegetables and herbs that supplied both the community's needs and commercial markets. Even skeptical observers who saw no obvious signs of coercion or abuse were impressed by the apparent contentment of the nearly 400 members. What outsiders couldn't perceive was the intricate web of surveillance and control the Richardson family had woven throughout Pleasant Hill. Every aspect of community life flowed through family members who reported directly to Samuel and Martha during their nightly strategy sessions. No decision, no matter how trivial, occurred without Richardson approval. No member could leave the grounds without a Richardson family escort, and even brief trips to nearby Harrodsburg required detailed justification and careful supervision. What modern psychologists would recognize as a perfect totalitarian environment had been created by the family. Information flowed only downward from the leadership, while surveillance ensured that any dissent was quickly identified and addressed. The community's isolation, both geographical and psychological, made resistance seem not just futile, but unthinkable to most members. A carefully designed indoctrination process that stripped away their previous identities and rebuilt their personalities according to Richardson's specifications was undergone by new converts. This process, supervised primarily by Rebecca and Martha Richardson, typically took 6 months to complete. By its conclusion, new members had been psychologically transformed into compliant followers who viewed questioning the family's authority as tantamount to questioning God himself. At every turn, this control was reinforced by the community's daily routine. Each morning at 4:30, members rose to the sound of Brother Caleb's bell, ate breakfast prepared under Hannah Collins's supervision, and spent their days at assigned tasks carefully designed to prevent private conversations or independent thinking. Evening worship services led by Samuel Richardson, with various family members playing supporting roles, combined genuine spiritual elements with subtle psychological manipulation that reinforced dependency and discouraged critical thinking. On a frigid February morning in 1812, the first crack in Pleasant Hill's perfect facade appeared. Brother Thomas Whitman, a successful merchant who had donated his entire estate to the community 5 years earlier, began asking uncomfortable questions about the community's finances during a public meeting. As one of the community's earliest and most generous converts, Brother Thomas had arrived at Pleasant Hill in 1807. A widower in his 50s whose children had died in a cholera outbreak, he had found comfort in the Shaker promise of spiritual family and eternal purpose. Much of the capital that allowed the Richardson family to establish their operations on such a grand scale was provided by his donation of a thriving dry goods business and substantial property holdings. For 5 years, Thomas had been the model community member. He worked tirelessly in Brother Ezekiel's agricultural operations, served as a mentor to younger converts, and never questioned the leadership's decisions. The community's reputation for spiritual authenticity was reinforced by his transformation from successful businessman to humble Shaker brother. But discrepancies that escaped other members' attention were noticed by Thomas because of his business background. His trained eye for financial details, combined with his access to certain operational records through his agricultural work, gradually revealed inconsistencies that troubled his conscience. The seed business profits reported by Brother Isaiah didn't match the amounts Thomas had observed during his visits to customer farms. The furniture workshop revenues seemed impossibly high given the number of pieces he saw being produced. Most puzzling of all, the community's membership numbers didn't align with the consumption records he maintained for feed and supplies. Brothers and sisters, Thomas stood during the monthly community meeting, his weathered hands holding several pages of carefully calculated figures. I've been praying about some concerns that weigh heavy on my heart. Our blessed community has prospered beyond measure. Yet I see contradictions in our records that trouble my soul. The silence that followed was deafening. Around the packed meeting hall, glances that lasted mere seconds but communicated volumes were exchanged by Richardson family members. Samuel Richardson's face remained serene, his hands folded peacefully in his lap. But those who knew him well noticed the subtle tightening around his eyes. Sister Martha's gentle smile never wavered, yet her knuckles whitened as she gripped her prayer book with increasing pressure. The seed business, Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his topic. Brother Isaiah reported profits of $800 from Ohio customers last quarter. But when I delivered supplies to those same farms, I calculated sales that should have generated nearly $1,200. Where has this missing money gone? From his seat near the door, Brother Caleb Richardson rose, ostensibly to check the room's temperature, but his movement positioned him between Thomas and the exit. Sister Rebecca's eyes never left Thomas's face, cataloging every expression and gesture for later analysis. Around the room, other Richardson family members made subtle adjustments to their positions, creating an almost imperceptible web of surveillance and control. Furthermore, Thomas pressed on, apparently oblivious to the dangerous territory he was entering. Our membership rolls show 400 souls, yet our food consumption suggests we're feeding barely 250. Brother Jeremiah's furniture workshops claim to employ 50 members, but I count only 37 who regularly report for that duty. These numbers don't reconcile. And as stewards of God's bounty, shouldn't we demand accuracy in our accounting? The response came not from Samuel, but from Mother Sarah Richardson, whose elderly voice carried surprising authority across the silent hall. Brother Thomas, she said, her tone mixing gentle correction with unmistakable warning, your concerns show a heart still attached to worldly thinking. In our blessed community, we trust that our leaders, guided by divine wisdom, manage all temporal matters for our spiritual benefit. Perhaps you need time for prayer and reflection to overcome these doubts that trouble your faith. Samuel Richardson nodded gravely, his expression radiating paternal concern for a wayward child. Brother Thomas, your dedication to our community's welfare touches my heart deeply. But perhaps your mind has been clouded by memories of your former worldly life. Sister Hannah, would you prepare Brother Thomas some of your special chamomile tea? I believe he needs rest and reflection to clear his thoughts of these troubling concerns. The meeting continued for another hour, but the atmosphere had been fundamentally altered by Thomas Whitman's questions. Other members avoided eye contact with him, suddenly finding urgent reasons to examine their prayer books or adjust their clothing. An underlying tension that hadn't existed before Thomas's intervention was carried by the Richardson family's responses to subsequent business items. That evening, Thomas was found dead in his dormitory bed by Sister Rebecca, who discovered the body during her routine evening inspection of the men's quarters. Her tearful announcement to the gathered community painted a picture of peaceful transition. Brother Thomas passed gently in his sleep, called home by the Lord after confessing his sin of doubt during evening prayers. His last words were an apology for allowing worldly concerns to cloud his spiritual vision. With the resigned faith they'd been conditioned to embrace, the community accepted this explanation. After all, questioning the leadership's account of events was tantamount to questioning God's will. A lesson about the dangers of allowing business concerns to interfere with spiritual submission became Brother Thomas's funeral the following day. But details that would haunt her for decades were noticed by young Sister Mary Caldwell, who cleaned the dormitories each morning. When she entered Thomas's room to prepare it for cleaning, she was struck by the bitter almond smell that lingered despite the room's windows being open all night. A distinct blue color that she'd never seen on any corpse, including her own grandfather who had died peacefully at home, had turned Thomas's fingernails. Most disturbing of all, she discovered traces of white foam around Thomas's mouth that Sister Rebecca had carefully wiped away before calling for help. In growing horror, Mary watched as Brother Caleb Richardson collected all of Thomas's personal papers, including the financial calculations that had started the crisis. That very night, these documents, along with Thomas's ledger books and correspondence, were burned in the communal fireplace during what Samuel Richardson described as a cleansing ceremony to purge worldly attachments from our sacred space. How thoroughly the Richardsons controlled information flow and emotional responses was revealed by the community's reaction. Within hours of Thomas's death, Sister Martha was leading prayer circles where members confessed their own doubts and worldly thoughts, creating an atmosphere where questioning leadership became synonymous with spiritual failure. Intensive work details that kept potential questioners busy from dawn to dusk, leaving no time for private conversations or independent reflection, were organized by Brother Ezekiel. Evening discussions about the dangers of challenging spiritual authority were led by Brother Jeremiah, using Thomas as a cautionary tale of what happened when faith wavered and worldly concerns corrupted pure hearts. The dual purpose of preventing future dissent while identifying members whose responses suggested they might harbor similar doubts was served by these sessions, which became a regular feature of community life. The most chilling aspect of the community's response was how quickly Thomas Whitman's memory was systematically erased. Within days, his personal belongings were redistributed. His work assignments were transferred to other members and his name was removed from community records except for a brief death notice. Within a month, it was as if Brother Thomas had never existed at all, his questions forgotten and his concerns dismissed as the ravings of a mind corrupted by worldly attachment. In the months following Thomas Whitman's death, a pattern began to emerge that would continue for over 2 decades, growing more sophisticated and ruthless with each iteration. What the Richardsons termed spiritual crisis, requiring special intervention, began to be experienced by members who asked probing questions about finances, who expressed desire to visit family outside the community, or who showed signs of wanting to leave Pleasant Hill. For handling dissent, Brother Jeremiah Richardson developed what became known as the retreat system. When someone questioned community practices or showed signs of independence, they would be assigned to special prayer and fasting retreats in isolated cabins scattered across the community's extensive property. These retreats, always supervised by various Richardson family members, were presented as opportunities for troubled souls to reconnect with divine purpose through solitude and meditation. The retreat cabins, constructed under Brother Jeremiah's direction in remote corners of the community's thousands of acres, were designed to appear rustic and spiritual while serving their true purpose as holding facilities. Each cabin contained a single room with basic furniture, heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from outside, and doors that locked only from the exterior. The cabin's isolated locations, connected to the main community only by narrow paths through dense woods, ensured that any sounds from within would never reach other members. The logistics of identifying retreat candidates were managed by Brother Caleb Richardson. His network of informants throughout the community reported private conversations, observed relationships, and monitored correspondence for signs of disloyalty or independent thinking. His methods were so subtle that most members never realized they were being watched, attributing chance encounters with Caleb to coincidence rather than systematic surveillance. Carefully developed criteria were followed by the selection process for retreats. Recent converts who asked too many questions about absent family members were prime candidates, as were longer-term members who showed signs of developing leadership potential that might threaten Richardson authority. Members who demonstrated excessive attachment to possessions they had donated, who expressed homesickness during community meetings, or who formed close friendships that might enable organized resistance, also found themselves selected for spiritual intervention. With remarkable sophistication, the community's correspondence was managed by Sister Hannah Collins, ensuring that worried family members received carefully crafted letters explaining their loved ones' sudden departures or deaths. Her penmanship was flawless, and she had studied each member's writing style with scientific precision, enabling her to forge convincing final letters that would satisfy distant relatives for years to come. Extensive preparation and planning were required for Hannah's forgery operation. She maintained detailed files on each community member's background, including samples of their handwriting, information about distant relatives, and knowledge of their pre-conversion lives that could be referenced in false correspondence. When someone was selected for elimination, Hannah would prepare multiple letters to be sent over several months, creating the illusion of an ongoing correspondence that gradually explained the person's absence. Touching notes from children they would never see again were received by parents in Ohio, describing spiritual revelations that called them to missionary work in untamed Western territories. Detailed accounts of peaceful deaths following brief illnesses, complete with descriptions of final words and burial ceremonies that never occurred, were received by siblings in Pennsylvania. The letters were masterpieces of emotional manipulation designed to provide closure while discouraging further inquiry. Perfect cover for disposing of evidence and maintaining the community's external relationships was provided by Brother Isaiah Richardson's seed business. His monthly trips to distant farms offered opportunities to bury bodies in remote locations across Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee, while simultaneously conducting legitimate business that reinforced his reputation as a trustworthy merchant and devout Shaker brother. Multiple purposes were served by Isaiah's routes, which were carefully planned. His legitimate customers provided alibis for his presence in distant locations, while his knowledge of remote farm properties, gained through years of business relationships, enabled him to identify burial sites that would never be discovered. He developed relationships with isolated farmers who welcomed his visits and never questioned his occasional requests to camp overnight on their property during bad weather. Methodical and efficient was the disposal process. Bodies were transported in specially modified seed wagons that appeared to contain normal agricultural supplies but included hidden compartments designed for their grisly cargo. Isaiah's reputation for punctuality and reliability meant that his overnight absences during trips were never questioned by customers who assumed he was maintaining his demanding schedule. Immaculate records maintained by Sister Patience Richardson were shown to local authorities when they occasionally inquired about missing persons. A marvel of bureaucratic deception was her documentation system, demonstrating through carefully crafted paperwork that individuals had left voluntarily for other communities or had died of natural causes with proper burial in the community cemetery. Far beyond simple membership logs extended Patience's record-keeping. She maintained detailed medical histories that could explain sudden deaths from natural causes, travel documentation that supported claims about members departing for distant communities, and correspondence files that included both genuine letters and Hannah's forgeries. Her organizational skills ensured that any official inquiry could be answered with convincing documentation that withstood casual scrutiny. Perhaps more chilling than their physical crimes was the psychological control the Richardson family maintained. They had created a closed system where questioning authority was equated with spiritual failure, where blind obedience was the highest virtue, and where members policed each other's thoughts and behaviors. The remaining community members weren't just victims. They had been transformed into unwitting accomplices in their own oppression. Despite the constant stream of new converts arriving monthly and the mysterious disappearances that occurred with increasing frequency, the community's population remained steady at around 400 members. This stability was maintained through what Brother Caleb privately called natural selection, the systematic removal of anyone who posed a threat to family control, balanced by aggressive recruitment of new converts whose property donations financed the operation's expansion. Sophisticated methods for identifying potential troublemakers before they could influence other members had been developed by the Richardson women, who carefully screened new arrivals. Actually serving to assess each convert's psychological profile, family connections, and potential value to the community were Sister Rebecca's intake interviews, conducted under the guise of spiritual counseling. Those deemed dangerous were marked for early elimination, while valuable converts underwent intensive indoctrination designed to strip away their previous identities. Genuine spiritual elements with systematic psychological abuse that created trauma bonds between victims and their abusers were combined in the indoctrination process, refined over years of practice. New converts were isolated from contact with the outside world while being subjected to alternating periods of intense attention and deliberate neglect that broke down their psychological defenses and made them desperate for approval from community leaders. By 1825, Pleasant Hill operated like a well-oiled machine of exploitation, its various components working together with mechanical precision that would have impressed any efficiency expert. Their methods had been refined by the Richardson family over 18 years of practice, transforming what had begun as opportunistic crimes into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated enormous profits while maintaining an impeccable public reputation. A complex organizational structure that maximized efficiency while minimizing risk had evolved into the family's division of labor. His role as spiritual leader and public face of the community was maintained by Samuel Richardson, delivering inspiring sermons that drew new converts regularly while keeping existing members focused on heavenly rewards rather than earthly concerns. His charismatic presence had become legendary throughout Kentucky's religious communities, with ministers from other denominations frequently citing Pleasant Hill as an example of successful Christian living. What amounted to a science of psychological manipulation had been developed by Martha Richardson, studying each community member with the intensity of a naturalist observing specimens. Her methods for breaking down individual resistance and rebuilding personalities according to family specifications had become so refined that the process typically took only 3 to 4 months to complete. She maintained detailed psychological profiles on every member, updating them regularly based on observations from her network of female relatives and informants. More sophisticated criminal operations that generated multiple revenue streams had been enabled by the community's expansion. Enormous profits that never appeared in the books shown to members were now generated by Brother Ezekiel Richardson's agricultural operations, which supplied produce to markets in Louisville, Lexington, and Cincinnati. His workforce of unpaid community members, maintained through psychological coercion rather than physical restraint, provided labor costs that made Pleasant Hill farms impossibly profitable compared to conventional operations. Similarly expanded had Brother Jeremiah Richardson's furniture workshops, producing pieces that were sold throughout the Ohio River Valley and marketed as authentic Shaker craftsmanship. The quality remained high because Jeremiah genuinely understood woodworking, but the labor was essentially slavery disguised as religious devotion. His workers put in 12 to 14-hour days producing furniture that sold for premium prices, with profits flowing entirely to the Richardson family's private accounts. How the family had begun selling community members to buyers who operated plantations and industrial facilities throughout the South and Midwest was the most insidious development. This human trafficking operation, coordinated primarily by Brother Isaiah during his seed business travels, provided the highest profit margins of any family enterprise while explaining the mysterious disappearances that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. Coldly calculated criteria were followed by the selection process for trafficking victims. Younger members with valuable skills but dangerous independent tendencies were prime candidates, as were individuals whose family connections made their continued presence at Pleasant Hill potentially problematic. Substantial sums for workers who came with fabricated documentation proving their voluntary servitude were paid by the buyers, who believed they were purchasing indentured servants rather than free citizens. The family's specialist in breaking down new converts and identifying those suitable for different fates had become Sister Rebecca Richardson. Her psychological assessment process, disguised as spiritual counseling, enabled her to categorize newcomers into groups: valuable long-term assets who would remain at Pleasant Hill, potential trafficking victims who could be sold for profit, and dangerous individuals who needed immediate elimination. Genuine spiritual guidance with systematic abuse that created powerful trauma bonds between victims and their abusers were combined in Rebecca's methods. She had studied the conversion experiences of legitimate Shaker communities, then perverted these techniques to serve the family's criminal purposes. Her sessions left converts psychologically dependent on her approval while stripping away their connections to previous identities and relationships. Both geographical and psychological had become the community's isolation, with members existing in a closed information environment where the Richardson family controlled every source of knowledge and interpretation. Located on thousands of acres of family-controlled land, members rarely encountered outsiders except during carefully supervised visits to nearby towns. Even these excursions were managed by Richardson family members who monitored all interactions and reported any conversations that suggested disloyalty. Extensive relationships with local authorities that provided protection from official scrutiny had been cultivated by the family. Essentially, a paid ally had become Sheriff William Morrison of Mercer County, receiving regular donations to his campaign funds and personal accounts in exchange for his assumption that Pleasant Hill was a model religious community deserving protection rather than investigation. Throughout the region's power structure, these relationships extended. Allies among local merchants, politicians, and religious leaders who viewed Pleasant Hill as a valuable economic and spiritual asset to their communities had been won by Brother Nathan Richardson's charm offensive. Substantial tax revenue and employment opportunities that made local officials reluctant to investigate rumors or complaints were provided by the community's legitimate business operations. Elaborate rituals and ceremonies that reinforced member dependency while identifying potential dissent had evolved to include the psychological control mechanisms. Authentic Shaker elements with subtle psychological manipulation that created altered states of consciousness where critical thinking became impossible were combined in Samuel Richardson's worship services. These services often lasted for hours, leaving participants emotionally drained and psychologically vulnerable to suggestion. Multiple purposes beyond spiritual guidance were served by evening confession sessions led by various Richardson family members. They provided opportunities to identify members harboring doubts or resentments, created public pressure for conformity through shame and guilt, and enabled the family to gather intelligence about private conversations and relationships that might threaten their control. Increasingly elaborate had become the confession process, with different family members specializing in extracting specific types of information. Sister Rebecca focused on relationships and emotional attachments that might enable resistance, while Brother Caleb concentrated on practical concerns like escape plans or contact with outside authorities. Sister Hannah monitored confessions for information about family members outside the community who might become problematic if they began asking questions. Despite her apparent frailty, Mother Sarah Richardson had emerged as the family's strategic mastermind, whose decades of experience in manipulation guided their long-term planning. Her ability to appear harmless while orchestrating complex criminal operations had become legendary among family members, who referred to her privately as the General in recognition of her tactical brilliance. Every aspect of the operation, from the selection of new territories for expansion to the development of new techniques for psychological control, was extended to by Sarah's influence. Her understanding of human nature, gained through 70 years of observing and manipulating others, enabled her to predict how individuals would respond to various pressures and rewards. Her strategic vision had transformed the family's criminal enterprise from opportunistic theft into a sustainable business model that could theoretically continue indefinitely. Increasingly sophisticated methods for maintaining security and preventing exposure had been required by the expansion of their operations. Elaborate communication systems that enabled coordination across their various enterprises while minimizing the risk of interception by hostile parties had been developed by the family. They used coded language in their correspondence, maintained separate financial accounts for different operations, and created false identities that could be used if rapid escape became necessary. From an unexpected source came the beginning of the end for the Richardson family's 27-year reign of terror. Attention from the legitimate Shaker leadership in Ohio had been attracted by their own success. In late 1833, the Ohio Union of Shaker Communities decided to send Elder Joseph Metcham, one of their most experienced and respected leaders, to evaluate Pleasant Hill for potential inclusion in their formal alliance of authenticated Shaker settlements. Not the typical visitor the Richardsons were accustomed to managing was Elder Metcham. A genuine disciple of Mother and Lee's teachings who had spent 40 years in Shaker communities across New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, he possessed an intimate knowledge of proper Shaker practices, record-keeping, and community structure that made him nearly impossible to deceive. His mission was to verify that Pleasant Hill truly followed authentic Shaker principles before recommending them for official recognition and inclusion in the union's collective decision-making processes. After years of glowing reports about Pleasant Hill's spiritual achievements and economic success, had come the evaluation request. The Ohio leadership had been impressed by accounts of the community's growth, their reputation for quality craftsmanship, and their apparent success in maintaining celibacy and communal property arrangements over more than 2 decades. Both an honor and a potentially devastating threat to the Richardson family's carefully constructed facade was represented by the decision to send Metcham. With apparent enthusiasm, Samuel Richardson initially welcomed the evaluation, confident that his family's carefully constructed facade would fool another religious leader. After all, they had successfully deceived hundreds of visitors over the years, including ministers from other denominations who had left Pleasant Hill convinced of its spiritual authenticity. Confidence that they could control the process and manipulate Metcham's conclusions had been given to the family by their experience in managing inspections. But alarm bells throughout the Richardson network were immediately raised by Metcham's first requests. Unlike previous visitors who were content with guided tours and carefully staged demonstrations of community life, Metcham wanted to examine financial records going back to the community's founding in 1807. He insisted on speaking privately with randomly selected members without Richardson family supervision or preparation. Most troubling of all, he brought his own accounting ledgers and expected to reconcile Pleasant Hill's reported membership numbers with their consumption records, work output, and correspondence logs. During his first meeting with Samuel Richardson, conducted in the community's main meeting hall before an audience of senior members, the scope of Metcham's investigation became clear. "Brother Samuel," Metcham said in his quiet but authoritative voice, "the Ohio Union has developed standardized procedures for evaluating potential member communities. We'll need to review your membership rolls, financial records, correspondence files, and burial registers for the past 5 years. We'll also need to conduct private interviews with at least 50 members selected through random drawing." The first crack in his usually perfect composure was revealed by Samuel's response. "Elder Metcham, we are honored by your visit and eager to demonstrate our commitment to Mother Ann's teachings. However, our record-keeping follows Kentucky practices that may differ from Ohio standards. Perhaps we could arrange a more informal evaluation that better reflects our unique circumstances." Metcham's expression remained pleasant but firm. "I appreciate your regional considerations, Brother Samuel, but the union standards apply equally to all communities regardless of location. Authentic Shaker practices are universal, not subject to regional variation. We'll begin with the membership rolls and burial registers tomorrow morning." That evening, an emergency meeting in Samuel's private quarters was held by the Richardson family, their voices hushed but their panic evident to anyone who might have been listening. Despite her apparent frailty, Mother Sarah Richardson took charge of the strategy session with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis. "This man knows things we can't fake," she whispered urgently. "He's asking for documentation we can't provide without exposing everything. We need to delay, deflect, and if necessary, eliminate the threat before he completes his investigation." The scope of their vulnerability was first articulated by Brother Isaiah Richardson. "He's asking for records going back 5 years, but our problems go back much further. The membership numbers alone will expose us. Our books show 400 members, but we've got maybe 250 actually living here. The burial registers are even worse. We've got graves for people who supposedly left for other communities." Another terrifying dimension to their predicament was added by Sister Hannah Collins. "He's already identified inconsistencies in the correspondence I've been maintaining with other communities. He knows Shaker writing conventions I never learned. And is asking questions about Mother Lee's teachings that our people can't answer because they were never properly instructed. Only intensified his suspicions and strengthened his resolve to uncover the truth were the family's initial attempts to delay and deflect Metcham's investigation. When they claimed certain records were stored in a building that had been damaged by recent storms, he pointed out that none of the buildings showed signs of weather damage. When they suggested interviewing specific members who could vouch for community practices, he insisted on selecting interview subjects himself through random drawing from a complete membership list. So effective at monitoring community members, Brother Caleb Richardson's surveillance network proved useless against an investigator who understood the importance of maintaining operational security. Mecham varied his routines, conducted interviews in different locations, and seemed to possess an intuitive awareness of when he was being watched. A depth of knowledge about authentic Shaker practices that made it impossible to maintain their deceptions was revealed by his questions during member interviews. Most dangerously, in ways that terrified the Richardson family, some of the community's surviving members began responding to Mecham's genuine spiritual presence. Sister Mary Caldwell, who had witnessed Brother Thomas Whitman's suspicious death over 20 years earlier, found herself drawn to Mecham's obvious authenticity and began sharing her long-suppressed observations about members who had mysteriously disappeared. Profound and immediate was the psychological effect of Mecham's presence on community members. For the first time in decades, they encountered someone whose spiritual authority didn't depend on fear, manipulation, or psychological abuse. An atmosphere where long-buried doubts and memories began to surface was created by his gentle questions about their experiences, his obvious knowledge of authentic Shaker practices, and his genuine concern for their spiritual welfare. Brother Jeremiah Richardson, whose furniture workshops provided crucial income for the family's operations, found his workers becoming increasingly unproductive as they spent time talking with Mecham about traditional Shaker craftsmanship techniques they had never been taught. Gaps in their knowledge that made it obvious they weren't receiving proper instruction in authentic Shaker methods were revealed by the conversations. Sister Rebecca Richardson's carefully controlled dormitory system began breaking down as female members started asking questions about Shaker practices they'd never heard of before Mecham's arrival. Her authority, so absolute for so many years, suddenly seemed questionable when compared to the obvious authenticity of their visitors' spiritual knowledge and gentle demeanor. When Mecham requested access to the community cemetery for a private memorial service honoring departed members, the investigation took a decisive turn. Without appearing suspicious, the Richardson family couldn't refuse such a reasonable request, but they also couldn't allow him to examine the burial grounds too closely without risking exposure of their crimes. To escort Mecham to the cemetery, hoping to control what he observed and limit his time among the graves, Brother Caleb volunteered. But inconsistencies that had escaped casual observers for decades were immediately noticed by Mecham's trained eye. The burial patterns didn't match the death dates in official records, and the condition of grave markers suggested many more interments than the documented deaths could account for. "Brother Caleb," Mecham said quietly as they stood among the headstones, "I noticed some irregularities in your burial records. This grave marker indicates Brother William died in 1829, but your correspondence files show letters from him dated 1830. How do you explain this discrepancy?" The desperation that was beginning to infect the entire family was revealed by Caleb's response. "Elder Mecham, perhaps there was an error in our record-keeping. Our sister Patience maintains extensive files, but even the most careful record-keeper can make mistakes when dealing with so many community members over so many years." Mecham's expression remained thoughtful but skeptical. "I understand that record-keeping can be challenging, but Shaker communities traditionally maintain extremely accurate documentation of deaths and departures. The inconsistencies I'm observing suggest systematic problems rather than occasional errors." That night, a discovery that would expose the full scope of the Richardson family's crimes and bring their 27-year reign of terror to an end would be made by Mecham. On the night of March 15, 1834, a discovery that would expose the full scope of the Richardson family's 27-year reign of terror was made by Elder Mecham. Unable to sleep due to his growing suspicions about the discrepancies he had uncovered during 3 weeks of investigation, he decided to examine the community's cemetery by moonlight, hoping to reconcile burial records with actual grave sites without Richardson family supervision. A graveyard that told two completely different stories was what he found. The official cemetery, maintained for visitors and official inspections, contained approximately 40 graves with proper headstones dating from 1807 to 1834. The markers were well crafted, obviously expensive, and arranged in neat rows that suggested careful planning and maintenance. But inconsistencies in the ground itself that revealed a far more sinister reality were noticed by Mecham's trained eye, sharpened by decades of experience managing authentic Shaker communities. Throughout the cemetery, Areas showed subtle depressions and variations in soil color that suggested many more burials than the headstones indicated. The earth in these unmarked sections had been disturbed and allowed to settle, forming barely perceptible indentations that would escape casual observation but were obvious to someone who understood how burial grounds evolved over time. The truth was also revealed by the vegetation patterns. Certain areas supported different plant growth than others, indicating soil that had been repeatedly disturbed and replaced. More chilling still, when he examined the dated graves more carefully, Mecham realized that many of the supposed death dates corresponded exactly with his list of members who had allegedly left Pleasant Hill to found new communities or visit distant relatives. The timeline was impossible. How could someone die and be buried at Pleasant Hill on the same day they were reported to have departed for Ohio or Tennessee? A pattern of deception so elaborate that it demonstrated years of careful planning was revealed by his systematic examination of each grave marker. Members who had supposedly died of natural causes were buried next to those who had allegedly left for missionary work in distant territories. The dates formed a chronicle of systematic elimination that coincided perfectly with moments when the community faced potential exposure or internal resistance. By Sister Mary Caldwell, who had been watching from her dormitory window and recognized an opportunity to finally reveal the truth she had carried for over 20 years, Mecham's investigation was interrupted. Moving silently through the darkness, she approached the cemetery with the desperate courage of someone who knew this might be her only chance to expose the horrors she had witnessed. "Elder Mecham," she whispered urgently as she approached his lantern-lit figure among the gravestones, "God has sent you to reveal the truth we've been too terrified to speak. What you're seeing here is only a small part of what the Richardson family has done to this community." In a conversation conducted in hushed tones among the silent graves, the horrifying truth she had carried in terrified silence for decades was revealed by Mary. "I've seen them bury people in the middle of the night," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed terror and long-awaited relief. "The Richardson family, they don't just control this community. They've been systematically murdering anyone who threatens their power or questions their authority." A picture of systematic elimination that went far beyond occasional murders to maintain control was painted by Mary's testimony, delivered in broken whispers as they crouched between headstones to avoid detection. What amounted to a death camp disguised as a religious community had been created by the Richardson family, where members who questioned finances, expressed homesickness, showed leadership potential, or simply knew too much about the family's activities were methodically eliminated. "Sister Hannah Collins keeps poisons in the kitchen stores," Mary revealed, her words tumbling out with the urgency of someone finally able to speak truth after years of enforced silence. "I've seen her preparing special meals for people who were asking too many questions. Brother Thomas Whitman wasn't the first. He was just the first time I was brave enough to really look at what was happening." As Mary continued her desperate confession, the scope of the family's criminal network became clear. Brother Caleb Richardson knows which members plan to leave before they even tell anyone. He reads their private letters and listens at dormitory doors. He has a list of people he calls problems and they disappear within days of being identified. "And Brother Jeremiah," she continued, glancing nervously toward the main buildings to ensure they weren't being observed, "is the one who disposes of the bodies. He has burial sites all across Kentucky, places where he buries people during his furniture delivery trips. I've seen him loading covered wagons at night, and I've seen him return with empty wagons and dirt under his fingernails." The scope of the family's operations beyond simple murder was the most horrifying revelation. A human trafficking network that sold the community's younger, healthier members to plantation owners and industrial operations as indentured servants was described by Mary. "They don't kill everyone," she explained. "The young ones, the strong ones, they sell them. Brother Isaiah's seed business is just a cover. He's actually delivering people to buyers throughout the South." That Pleasant Hill wasn't a corrupted Shaker community, but a criminal enterprise that had never been legitimately Shaker at all was realized by Elder Mecham. That the Richardson family had likely murdered the original Shaker leaders who established the settlement, then assumed their identities to inherit a ready-made community of trusting, obedient followers was revealed by Mary's knowledge of the community's early history. "The real Elder Samuel died in 1808, Mary whispered, "just 1 year after the community was founded. I was just a girl then, But I remember him being different, gentler, more concerned with our spiritual welfare than with profits and control. The man who calls himself Samuel Richardson now is someone else entirely." With devastating force, the implications of Mary's revelations hit Mecham. Not only had the Richardson family been committing mass murder for over 25 years, but they had done so while systematically destroying the authentic Shaker community that had originally been established at Pleasant Hill. They had perverted genuine spiritual seeking into a tool for exploitation and murder, using people's deepest religious longings as weapons against them. As dawn approached, a terrible choice that would determine the fate of the nearly 250 community members who remained alive was faced by Mecham. If he confronted the Richardson family directly with his knowledge, he would almost certainly become their next victim, and his death would eliminate the only outside witness to their crimes. But if he left Pleasant Hill to seek outside help, the family might eliminate all the remaining witnesses before authorities could intervene. As he knelt among the silent graves, the weight of nearly 300 lives lost, and the 250 souls still trapped in this nightmare pressed upon him. Her fate now linked to his decisions, Mary Caldwell waited beside him. Around them, the cemetery held its secrets in the pre-dawn darkness, bearing witness to decades of systematic murder disguised as religious devotion. Whether the Richardson family's reign of terror continued, or whether justice would finally come to Pleasant Hill after 27 years of carefully concealed horror would be determined by Mecham's decision. The events that would finally bring justice to the Richardson family's victims were set in motion by Elder Mecham's decision to flee Pleasant Hill in the pre-dawn hours of March 16, 1834, carrying Mary Caldwell with him as a witness. They rode through the night to Harrodsburg, where Mecham convinced Sheriff Morrison and a federal marshal to organize an immediate raid on the community. Armed with Mary's detailed testimony and Mecham's documentation of the numerous discrepancies he had discovered, the federal authorities' involvement proved crucial as it later emerged that Sheriff Morrison had been receiving regular payments from the Richardson family for his willful blindness to their activities. A detachment of 12 men and legal authority that superseded local jurisdiction was brought by the federal marshal, Captain James Crawford, ensuring that the Richardson family couldn't use their network of corrupted officials to escape justice. A scene that haunts Kentucky law enforcement records to this day was what the authorities discovered upon their return to Pleasant Hill. A desperate decision to eliminate all witnesses and escape with whatever portable wealth they could carry had been made by the Richardson family, realizing their exposure was inevitable. Of the 250 community members who had been alive when Mecham arrived 3 weeks earlier, only 37 were found still living when the raid commenced. Stories that revealed the true scope of the Richardson family's crimes over nearly 3 decades were told by the surviving members, discovered locked in basement storage rooms beneath the community's main buildings. For 2 days, they had been confined without food or water while the family debated whether to kill them all or select the most valuable for sale to distant buyers before fleeing Kentucky permanently. The strongest evidence of the family's human trafficking operations was represented by these survivors, chosen for their youth and physical capabilities rather than any mercy from their captors. Several had been marked for sale to plantation owners in Mississippi and Alabama, with transportation arrangements already completed and payments received. A systematic operation that had sold hundreds of community members into slavery while maintaining the facade of voluntary departures for missionary work was revealed by their testimony. Every horrific detail of the survivors' testimonies was supported by the physical evidence discovered during the raid. Throughout the community's extensive property, hidden burial sites were found, containing remains that showed signs of poisoning, strangulation, and blunt force trauma. Methodically organized were the burial sites, with detailed maps found in Brother Jeremiah Richardson's workshop indicating the location of every hidden grave. Over 150 unmarked graves scattered across the community's thousands of acres were discovered by searchers, many containing multiple bodies that had been disposed of during the same time periods. That the Richardson family had been systematically murdering community members since at least 1812 was confirmed by the condition of the remains combined with artifacts found in the graves, with the killing accelerating dramatically in recent years as their confidence in their methods grew. In the Richardson family's private quarters, detailed ledgers documenting their human trafficking operations with the precision of any legitimate business enterprise were found by investigators. The records included the names of buyers, the prices paid for individual community members, and detailed descriptions of the merchandise being sold. Over $40,000 in profits over the past decade had been generated by the trafficking operation, far exceeding the income from their legitimate business activities. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of Martha Richardson's personal journal, which revealed the psychological techniques the family had developed to maintain control over their victims. The journal, written over 15 years, documented systematic experiments in human manipulation that would have impressed modern psychologists with their sophistication and ruthlessness. No remorse for the hundreds of lives destroyed by her family's activities was shown in Martha's writings. Instead, they contained clinical observations about which methods proved most effective for different personality types, detailed analyses of how to break down psychological resistance, and strategic planning for expanding their operations to other states. A woman who viewed other human beings as resources to be exploited rather than souls deserving of respect and compassion was revealed by her entries. Detailed psychological profiles of every community member, updated regularly based on observations from her network of female relatives and informants, were also contained in the journal. These profiles included assessments of each person's value as a worker, their potential for resistance, their usefulness as breeding stock for future generations of workers, and their suitability for various types of exploitation. Swift and decisive was the Richardson family's fate, though their trial revealed details that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. Samuel, Martha, and their 6 adult children were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, fraud, and human trafficking. National attention was drawn by the trial, conducted in Frankfurt throughout the summer of 1834, as newspapers across the country covered the unprecedented scope of their crimes. A picture of systematic evil that challenged contemporary understanding of human depravity was painted by the testimony presented during the trial. Witness after witness described decades of psychological torture, physical abuse, and systematic murder carried out with the efficiency of a business operation. So overwhelming was the evidence that the jury required only 2 hours to return guilty verdicts on all charges. All 7 Richardson family members were convicted and sentenced to death, with executions carried out in October 1834 before crowds that included many former community members who had escaped or been sold into slavery years earlier. A sense of justice for the victims was provided by the executions, but they couldn't restore the lives that had been stolen or heal the trauma that would affect survivors for the rest of their lives. The overwhelming challenge of rebuilding their lives after decades of psychological and physical abuse that had stripped away their identities and connections to the outside world was faced by the 37 survivors. What we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder was struggled with by many, unable to trust religious communities, authority figures, or even their own judgment about other people's motivations. From their experiences at Pleasant Hill, several survivors never recovered. The systematic psychological abuse they had endured left them unable to function independently in normal society. They spent their remaining years in state institutions, haunted by memories of the horrors they had witnessed and the friends they had lost to the Richardson family's systematic brutality. With the help of genuine religious communities that provided psychological support and practical assistance, others found the strength to rebuild their lives. A special fund to help Pleasant Hill survivors transition to normal life was established by the Ohio Union of Shaker Communities, led by Elder Metcham, providing financial support, job training, and counseling services that helped many eventually achieve some measure of peace and stability. Most of the Pleasant Hill investigation records were quietly sealed by the state of Kentucky, concerned that publicizing the full details would damage the region's reputation and discourage religious settlement throughout the Bluegrass region. Under state supervision, the community's buildings were eventually demolished and the land was sold to private farmers who were told only that the previous religious community had disbanded following financial difficulties. That many details never became public knowledge was meant by the secrecy surrounding the case, allowing rumors and speculation to replace factual accounts of what had actually occurred at Pleasant Hill. The state's interests in preventing copycat crimes and protecting Kentucky's reputation were served by this deliberate obscurity. But it also meant that the victims' stories were never fully told and their suffering never adequately acknowledged. That the Richardson family murdered or sold into slavery over 400 people during their 27-year operation is estimated by modern historians who have gained access to the sealed records. The actual number may be even higher, as their record-keeping focused on profits rather than comprehensive documentation of their crimes, and many victims may have been eliminated without any record of their existence at Pleasant Hill. How easily religious faith can be weaponized by those who understand the psychology of control and manipulation is shown to us by this mystery. For nearly 3 decades, the Richardson family succeeded because they exploited people's deepest spiritual longings, transforming the desire for divine connection into a tool of oppression and murder. Their success depended on the isolation they created around their victims, cutting them off from outside support and making resistance seem impossible rather than merely difficult. That evil often disguises itself as virtue, using the language of spirituality and community to mask the most brutal exploitation is reminded to us by the Pleasant Hill tragedy. The importance of maintaining connections between religious communities and the broader society, ensuring that isolation never becomes so complete that abuse can flourish undetected, is demonstrated by the Richardson family's ability to maintain their facade for so many years. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or might there be even darker secrets buried in Kentucky's sealed archives? That the full scope of the Richardson family's crimes may never be completely understood is suggested by the state's decision to keep most records classified. Leave your comment below and share your theories about what other horrors might still be hidden in those forbidden files. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.